Welcome to today's Policy and Advocacy Conference luncheon. I am Carol Ray, immediate past president of the American Planning Association, and it's my privilege to introduce our luncheon speaker. I am delighted to welcome Ryan Avent. Mr. Avent is a senior editor and economics columnist on topics related to planning and communities. He is also the author of the recent book, The Wealth of Humans. Previously, he wrote another title with planning implications, The Gated City. In The Wealth of Humans, he explores the changing nature of who is working and how we work. He looks at the economic and technological forces changing our work around the globe and how these trends are driving our politics and shaping our communities. Planners are always analyzing today to develop local visions for the future. How we work is, of course, an important part of how we plan for the future. And how we plan for things like housing and infrastructure can play a big role in managing changes in how we work and how we live. Many of us are already working on plans that incorporate new levels of automation and new patterns of development driven by these changes. So I know you are eager to hear his insights. Perhaps he'll also let us know if planner bots are coming to take our jobs. So please join me in welcoming Ryan Avent.
Thank you very much. I think the bots eventually are coming for all of our jobs. I think there was a recent piece of news about the Washington Post, which said that last year roughly 800 of their stories were written by an algorithm. So, as if those of us in the journalism world didn't have enough troubles, that we got to deal with the robots as well. But thank you all very much for having me here. It's very good to be with you today, and welcome to Washington, to the future home of Amazon's HQ2, as we like to say around here. I don't know if our odds are better or worse than other places, but it does seem like a bit of an advantage that Jeff Bezos just bought a house here and a newspaper. It seems like he likes being here, so we'll see how that goes. Has there been much discussion of the Amazon contest here today? I imagine that stirred up a little bit of it. Not okay. I think actually for all the things that are going on right now, for those of us who have long had an interest and a passion really for cities and how they work and the role they play in the economy and in our society, that this actually is a pretty important and in some ways exciting time, that there's renewed attention on the roles that cities play, on the things that we can do to help them thrive and to increase accessibility to our thriving places and to try to help places that are not thriving. And I'm hopeful that out of the difficulties we've been experiencing really over the past decade, that this discussion will pick up some momentum, and that we will we'll find new ways to address a lot of our challenges. And I don't want to talk too much today about politics, but I'm going to set out kind of I guess what I'd say is a sweeping discussion of what I think is going on with the economy and what the implications are for cities and for planners. And I think before doing that, it is worth noting the context of this discussion. And that context, I think, is, as you look around the world, is one in which people are frustrated. They are disappointed in many cases with how things have gone for them and their families over the last few years or the last few decades. There's confusion as to why these changes are occurring, and there's a lot of bitter disappointment. And these disappointments at times manifest themselves in a willingness to vote for leaders or for parties that we would have thought perhaps are outside the usual political mainstream, to embrace policy ideas or ideologies that we might have thought we had relegated permanently to being outside the mainstream. And I think it's tempting often to write this off as kind of the hangover from the financial crisis and something that's going to fade out as we continue that recovery. But I think it would be unwise to come to that conclusion. I think the seeds for a lot of these movements were present and apparent before the financial crisis. They persisted for quite a long time after the financial crisis. And I think it doesn't take much imagination to say that while it seems now like the economies in a lot of different places are improving and healing, that things wouldn't have to go very wrong in the near future for the politics to become much worse and for for the strains that have been placed on our institutions by a lot of economic changes to find their way into some really damaging policies that could do a lot of harm. And so, as we look around and we see cities and households who have diminished economic expectations, for themselves and their children, as we see the problem of rising inequality, both across the distribution of households, but also between places, and as we see the way that those gulfs between the haves and the have-nots contribute to feelings of isolation and polarization of the citizenry, I think it's, we have to keep that in mind in the stakes whenever we're talking about the policies that we're interested in. And that's one thing I want to talk to you all today is about how high the stakes are for the work that you do. So what exactly is behind all of these kind of worrying trends that we've seen over the last few years? Well, I think the way I tend to sum up what we've been experiencing is, I guess it's somewhat melodramatic, but it's what I call the global eclipse of labor. And this shows up in lots of different statistical series and lots of different kind of social outcomes, but I'm just going to highlight a few here. I guess first and most importantly, since the 1970s, economic growth has slowed down pretty significantly across most of the industrialized world. And it's not just GDP growth that's slowed, productivity growth has also slowed. And productivity growth is really important. That's the way we figure out how to do more with less. It's how we raise our standard of living over time. And so the fact that there's been a sustained slowdown, but for a few years in the late 1990s, is a serious problem. And this is not just about demographics. It is true that aging is part of this slower growth story, but it also seems that we're just not doing as good a job coming up with good ideas, translating those good ideas into new businesses and new technologies, new ways of doing things that raise people's standards of living. As growth has slowed, we've also seen stagnation in people's incomes. And so for some groups, particularly men or for those without a college education, there's really been a generation in which wages haven't gone up by much at all. But for nearly all of us, since 2000, wages have been pretty stagnant. We just got a new data point from Bureau of the Census recently that showed that the household income for the median household in America, adjusted for living costs, just reached an all-time high, overcame the previous peak, which was reached in 1999. And it's good that we got over that hump finally. It's good that that happened, but it basically means that for almost 2 decades, there's been almost no progress for the typical American. And so it's not hard to understand why people might be a little upset about how things are playing out. And that's the typical American that we're talking about. Things are different if you look toward the top of the income spectrum. From the 1980s, the top 20% has done very well, while the bottom 80% or so has done poorly. But really, since the 2000s, the gains from growth have fallen almost exclusively on kind of the top 1%. And that top 1% suffered a bit during the Great Recession as asset prices tumbled, but as we've seen, asset prices have recovered quite well. And so the story in terms of the distribution has been one in which the 1% are ever better at capturing the gains from growth. And then another thing, and this is what I'm showing you here in the chart, is what we've seen across countries is a decline in the share of income that's produced each year that goes to workers in the form of wages and salaries, as opposed to people who own capital or people who own property or land. And this is true across rich economies and poor. It's true across manufacturing-based economies and service-based economies. And it's a really dramatic and worrying trend. And I think what all these things reflect is a world in which the economy is not functioning the way we would hope that it would. And the brunt of that pain is being borne by workers, and primarily by workers who are outside of the top 1%. And this is kind of the gloomy picture. I know I'm starting off on kind of a dismal note here, but this is where we are, and where I think we can expect to stay for a while. And I'll tell you why. Now, what do we think is causing all of these different trends? Well, I don't want to say that I've got the one single answer for what's going on, and there have been a lot of changes that have occurred over the last 3 to 4 decades. It's certainly the case that tax regimes have changed, regulatory regimes have changed to make things more favorable in some senses for the very rich. It's also the case that unions have become less powerful. That's certainly a factor. But if you look across the world at how many places are showing these sorts of trends, and all these different places have different approaches to taxes and regulation and whatnot, you have to sort of conclude that there is a bigger structural transformation going on in the economy. And I sort of describe this structural transformation as a digital revolution. I didn't come up with that, obviously, but that's what I sort of use as my catch-all term for what we're going through. And in my view, this digital revolution is going to turn out to be as important, as transformative and disruptive, and ultimately as beneficial as the Industrial Revolution was. I think it's that kind of epoch that we're talking about, and we're just in the first few decades of it. Now, what do I mean by the digital revolution? Well, it sort of began in the 70s and 80s with automation, advanced manufacturing techniques that came into a lot of plants. You saw the spread of computing across firms and into households. You've seen dramatic improvements in communication technologies and the ability to gather and analyze data, all of which was very important. Kind of a knock-on effect from improving communications technology and data technology was a change in the way firms did business so that they spread their production across global supply chains all over the world. And that in turn has led over the last 15 to 20 years to an era that we occasionally refer to as hyper-globalization, of rapid global integration, which has also meant kind of the financialization of the global economy. It's brought more than 1 billion workers in low-wage countries like China and India into the global labor force, which has been very good for those places, which has been a disruptive thing for industrialized countries to handle. And now I think we're seeing continued progress in this digital revolution, and even in some cases intensification of this progress, thanks to the emergence of really powerful machine learning, artificial intelligence techniques. And this is the stuff that's going to blow our minds over the next 10 to 20 years. We have software programs that much more quickly than we had anticipated are learning to do complex tasks, complex cognitive tasks, like drive cars and trucks, something that's going to be very much on the menu, I'm sure, at future conferences here, but also learn to anticipate our needs before we even know that we have them, and learn to understand human speech, and in some cases to carry on basic conversations with individuals. And so, if you think about that, you can begin to see all the different industries in which these changes are going to be having a huge effect, and all the different occupations that are going to be facing some pretty serious challenges, and either because they're being replaced by robots or having their responsibilities kind of fundamentally changed by what these new things can do. And so I think that this is where we are, and this is a big reason why I don't think the hardships of the last 10 to 20 years are about to suddenly disappear, sadly. Now, I spent a lot of time thinking about the Industrial Revolution. I'm sure that's true of all of you as well. I studied economic history as a graduate student, and so I try to inject a little bit, subject you all to a little bit of economic history. But when we think about the Industrial Revolution, I think we tend to think this was a process that really made the world much, much better off. You kind of go in on one side, and the population is mostly illiterate. They don't live very long. Most people kind of work in agriculture, working at subsistence levels. Things are not all that great. And then you come out the other side, and we have cars, and we have televisions, and we have microwaves. Life expectancy is much longer. Incomes are much higher. And so, I think the thought that a lot of us have is that when you have a revolution like this, it makes everyone much, much better off, and everyone feels good, and it's your grandparents see that the world changes during their lifetime in positive ways. And I think that's true. That is what happened. But the lessons of economic history remind us that it took a really long time, and a lot of bad stuff happened along the way. And so for the first 100 years or so of the British Industrial Revolution, wages didn't really go up at all for workers. Even after they started to go up, inequality remained quite high, and a side effect of stagnant wages and rising inequality was the growth of kind of radical ideological movements, which in turn led to revolutions and wars and things like that. And so I'm not suggesting that this is what we're in for, but I do think it's worth recalling that big technological revolutions, while they ultimately do tremendous good, create a lot of difficulties that we, as policymakers or as thinkers, have to grapple with and try to overcome. And certainly you see that when you look at the digital revolution. And I would just point to a few big effects that I think it's having on the way our economy works. The first, I would say, is that we are increasingly in the midst of an abundance of labor. And an abundance sounds like a good thing. It sounds like something we would want to have. But if you think about what happens when there's an abundance of wheat or oil, the price of wheat and oil goes down quite a lot. So if you are the thing that is in abundance, and we are the thing that is in abundance, then that's not necessarily a good thing. And it's not surprising necessarily that incomes wouldn't have grown by very much. And this abundance has multiple sources. Some of it comes from the fact that really skilled workers can use technology to do work that previously required many more less skilled workers. Some of it has to do with globalization and the increasing ability to take advantage of hundreds of millions of laborers in other countries, and that's adding to the abundance of labor. And then, of course, there's automation. Automation comes in, adds to the effective labor that a company can use, displaces people who then have to go out and look for new jobs. And so you have all these different sources of available workers, this abundance. And then the upshot of all that is that companies, when faced with workers who are asking for raises, have lots and lots of tools at their disposal to say, no, we don't really feel any pressure to give you a raise. And so that's one of the big stories, I think, of the digital revolution, is this abundance of labor. Now, a second part of it, I think, is that when wages aren't growing, as they haven't been, all sorts of other things about the economy stop working or don't work the way we would want them to. So I'll give you an example. Consumer spending, we all know, is kind of the thing that powers growth in the American economy. We rely on people to buy more and more and more stuff. Now, if wages aren't growing, to buy more and more stuff, you have to borrow. And so there's pressure on governments to ease lending standards, make it easier for people to borrow. You keep having these recurrent accumulations of debt that lead to crises or other dysfunction. And the economy generally seems like it's not working in the right way. Or to give you another example, firms, when when they have a queue of workers waiting to work for very low pay, feel much less pressure to invest in the workers they've already got. They feel less pressure to invest in training, to improve the productivity and the skill set of the workers they've got. They feel less pressure to invest in new technology to improve the productivity of the workers they've got. Why bother when they can throw a bunch of minimum wage workers at the problem? And so we have less investment, we have a bigger problem of indebtedness, and we have an economy that just seems like something is broken with it. And then the third big effect, I think, is that there are big economic benefits that are being generated by this digital revolution, but they are incredibly concentrated. And I think maybe Richard Florida has talked about this some this morning, but you have this phenomena of superstar workers, professionals, superstar firms, superstar cities. And you have, in a digital economy, if you come up with a big new idea, you can then sell that idea all over the world. You can sell your software all over the world. You can sell your pop song all over the world. You can sell your fund management skills all over the world because it's a digital world. And what that means is that the people who are at the top of their profession in these kinds of industries are suddenly able to serve many more clients, to make much more money, and generally to reap an outsized share of the gains from growth. And so this is what we're observing. We're seeing the gains from growth go to a smaller set of individuals, to a smaller set of companies, and consequently to a smaller set of places. We have superstar cities and we have the rest. And perhaps you can see where I'm going to go with this now. So when we look at historical economic revolutions, it's always clear that there is a geographic footprint that those revolutions have. There are big geographic effects, big regional effects that those transformations have. And the current one is no exception. There have been big geographic effects. They're going to continue, and it's important to understand them. So if you look at how regions within rich countries grew in the period before the 1980s, we see a pattern of growth that was very different from what we see now. So from about the 1880s to the 1980s, poor American states grew faster than rich American states. It wasn't always by fast enough so that over the course of that century they completely caught up, but there was nonetheless this process of convergence. And that wasn't just an American thing. Poor Japanese prefectures caught up to rich Japanese prefectures. Poor European regions grew faster than rich European regions. And this was the way things sort of worked. And we kind of thought that was just how it was up until about the 1980s. And from the 1980s, something changed. And this process of catch-up slowed down. And from the 2000s, it stopped completely. So across regions, you just no longer had convergence between rich and poor. And then if you look at the metropolitan level, you often had outright divergence. So you had places that in the 1980s had a very high share of college graduates in their population, over the next 30 years, the share of college graduates went up. In places that began that period with very low level of college graduates in their population, saw that level tend to either stagnate or decline. You saw cities that began this period with high productivity levels have the gap in their productivity grow over that time. This shows up in all sorts of different ways. If you look at venture capital investment has become more concentrated in a smaller group of really successful cities. Employment in high skill categories and technical, scientific, and engineering categories has become more concentrated over the last 30 years. And this is really quite a significant concern that we have. And I'll tell you why it's a concern. You might think, this is just how it goes, right? If we look back at the Industrial Revolution, some cities were well positioned to take advantage of new industry. They grew enormously, and we're better for it. And there's an element of truth to that, certainly. But what we aren't seeing as we look at the places that are well positioned to benefit from digital technology and that are thriving as a result, what we aren't seeing in those places is very much population growth. And I'm not telling you guys anything you don't already know. I realize that. But if you look, for instance, at the population of San Francisco over the last 30 years, San Francisco metropolitan area, it's grown by about a third. Now, that's a lot. That's a lot. I'm sure to people living in San Francisco, that felt like a really big deal. But if you look back at what happened in Manchester between 1811 and 1841, the population roughly doubled over that time frame. The population of Shanghai over the last 30 years has roughly doubled. If you look at the population of Chicago from 1860 to 1890, it grew tenfold. And that was by no means an unrepresentative experience. You had lots of industrial cities that just enjoyed explosive growth as people realized that this is where the new technologies are, this is where the new jobs are, this is where the new opportunities are, and consequently moved to them to take advantage of them. And that ended up being a really good thing. It was a good thing for the national economy. It's a good thing for the national economy when people move in this way. These thriving places are places where new ideas are being generated, where new techniques are being perfected, and to learn them, you often have to be in the room. You often have to be there where the techniques are being created. And so people, when they move from poorer places to richer places, they tend to become more productive. They tend to have their income go up. You have to be there to be able to learn these things or to sell goods and services to the people who are developing these things. And so estimates of sort of the damage we've done to ourselves and not having as much population growth in our successful places are just astounding. And there's a recent study, which you may be familiar with, that said that over the last 50 years, had we done a better job moving people into our most successful places, then GDP would have been 13% higher than it currently is. Now, in an economy like the United States, which is an $18 trillion economy, that's a lot. That's trillions of dollars that households don't have to spend on themselves, that we as a society don't have to spend on infrastructure or healthcare or pensions or efforts to fight climate change. Those are resources that are just lost. And so this is a tremendous opportunity that we're failing to seize here. So then we have to ask ourselves, why exactly aren't people moving to these thriving places? And again, I'm going to be telling you things that I'm sure already know, but it's not the case that there's one single explanation for everything. There's not one explanation for why population in San Francisco or New York or Boston or Washington isn't growing explosively. Some of it has to do with the fact that Americans just move less than they used to. Mobility has been falling for a while now, and that has to do with demographic changes, with the rise of two-earner households. Some of it is due to government policy, which discourages moves. So you have a rise in occupational licensing, which means that you can, if you are a nurse or a dentist or a doctor or a hairdresser, move from one state to another to practice. But it's more costly and annoying than it used to be. You have to be recertified, and that just, any little burden discourages some moves. Some of it is about government benefit policies. If you are a teacher who splits time between two different school systems, you can, on average, expect to earn a pension that is one half that of a teacher who stays in the same school system for their entire time because of the way we tend to structure our public pensions. And then there are also massive subsidies for home ownership, which are there in part to try to get people to stay put so that they become invested in their community. But what has ended up happening is that the incentive that people have to stay put is keeping them rooted in places that are disconnected from a lot of these new opportunities and disconnected from the people who are seizing on these opportunities, and there is a gulf there, a social gulf. But I think that when we think about what's really keeping people out of our most successful few metropolitan areas, what we're really talking about is high housing costs and about the supply constraints that lead to those high housing costs. And so if you look at Houston, someone who's earning the median income for the United States, which is a little bit below $60,000 a year, can afford to buy the median home in Houston. Typical American can buy a home there, the median home. In Washington, I actually didn't believe this. I would have thought it would have been much worse. But in Washington, the salary you need to buy the median home is $80,000. Keep in mind, this is the median, which means that half of all sales are going to be at prices, or you're going to need a salary above that, and those homes are going to be the ones that tend to have better access to transport and good schools and jobs and all that. So we're just talking about the median home. But the figure is $80,000 in Washington. In New York, it's $100,000. And in San Francisco, it's $160,000, or more than 3 times the median household income in the United States, to buy the median home in San Francisco. And that, to me, is just, this is the world that this is the country that we've built for ourselves right now. It's one in which the most exciting opportunities are in a place that is entirely out of reach to the typical American. And this, I think, it would be correct to identify it as a crisis, as a serious crisis. Now, why is it that prices are so much higher? I think that, again, there are multiple factors at work. San Francisco is not the same as Houston, and so when you pay for housing in San Francisco, you're paying for a different set of amenities and different kinds of jobs than you would if you were paying for a house in Houston. And so no matter what, there's going to be a difference in price there. So that's part of it. But I think really we have to talk about housing supply issues. And again, not all of that is policy related. The Bay Area is the Bay Area. It has its geographical constraints. It has areas set aside that can't be developed to preserve nature, and I think that's a fantastic thing. But those aren't really the constraints that I think are binding the situation. You only have to drive down the peninsula to see what the problem is. And the problem is that huge amounts of the most valuable real estate in the country are covered with single-family homes. And those single-family homes are occupied by people who are willing to fight to the death just about to prevent anything other than single-family homes from being built anywhere close by. And we could double the density of the peninsula, still have an area that was, nothing like Manhattan, but would still feel very suburban, but we would have added significantly to housing stock in the area. But we're not able to do that. And I think the reason we're not able to do that, as you all, I'm sure, or some of you at least would agree, it has to do with constraints in the law, constraints in the zoning code, other regulatory restrictions, and general NIMBY opposition to development. And I think the thing that I would try to emphasize here again is that these people, while they almost certainly feel that they're not doing much harm or indeed are doing good for their community, are costing the economy trillions of dollars and are helping nurture these social divisions that I think underlie a lot of the difficulties we face as a country. So then we should need to talk about what we can do about it. And that is where things get difficult. And I wish this section of the talk were longer, but unfortunately, I'm relying on all you to come up with the really hard decisions. But I do have a few thoughts that I think might be a productive way to begin a discussion. Excuse me. So I think certainly one thing to note is that education is going to help. That making people aware of the nature of the problem and the consequences of the problem is an important first step. And that's something that I have certainly tried to do, is say, you guys may not realize that this is going on, but it's having these consequences. We really need to talk about it. And I think that conversation is beginning to resonate more and more with people. It hasn't yet translated into the kind of development or the kind of redesign of cities that we might have hoped to follow from that. So I think that's an initial step, but it's by no means a sufficient step. I think that by grappling with the sort of political dynamics, the local political dynamics that lead or that encourage downzoning or make it easy to fight new construction, we can come up with better ways to do city planning. And the nature of the problem is not very complicated. You have individuals in close proximity to new developments have a strong incentive to fight them. they're going to have to deal with all the problems associated with construction. They're going to be the ones who have to deal with congestion in their public spaces from parks and roads and schools. And they're the ones who have been living in this place and perhaps are not interested in seeing others come in, perhaps of different socioeconomic background. And limiting development is one very effective and still acceptable way to kind of filter out who you want and don't want in your community. And so you have a group of people that has an incredibly strong incentive to fight new development. Now, new development also generates lots of benefits, but those benefits are spread very diffusely. I, living here in Arlington, would receive some small benefit from increased construction in San Francisco, but it's not enough, sadly, and maybe it should be, but it's not enough to get me to get on a plane every time there's a zoning board fight over a home in Palo Alto that they wants to add a granny flat or whatever. So, so you have this asymmetry of incentives, and what it means is that systematically it's much easier to fight development than it is to accept it. And we don't want to silence voices that are opposed to development. They often have very real concerns. But what we can do is kind of change the way that we make policy so that more voices are heard, so that there's a rebalancing of the power interests. And I'll give you an example. These are not ideas, by the way, that I've come up with individually. These are ideas I've borrowed from other scholars who've been working in the area, David Schleicher and others, and so I don't want to take credit for them. But a zoning budget is, I think, a very promising way to approach this topic. And so what you do is, and forgive me if I'm telling you something you already know, but what you do is every few years you sit down, you decide as a city, or even better as a metropolitan area, how much housing do we need to create to meet the needs of our citizens and the needs of our economy? How much housing supply growth should there be? And you set that number, that's your budget. And then you have a negotiation from all the different parts, because you have to allocate that budget across different parts of the region. And if there are places within the region that really are adamant that they don't want or can't use any more development, then they're free to bargain to lower their allowance. But that has to be offset somewhere else by an increasing allowance. And so you use this, everyone has the chance to express their preferences, but what you're making sure is that people in sort of having their voice heard and having their preferences satisfied aren't hurting the economy of the region as a whole. So I think this kind of thing is very promising. Another option, I think, it would be to sort of draw a lesson from the economics and the politics of international trade. So when you're trying to negotiate a trade deal, you often include trade adjustment assistance. And trade adjustment assistance is in there so that if people are negatively affected by trade liberalization, they are then given some money to help them handle, typically not enough, but some to help them make the adjustment to this new trading environment. And we do that in part because it seems like the right thing to do, that these people are having their lives upended, and we owe it to them to help them out. But we also do it because it makes the political debate about trade deals much more simple. It kind of reduces the incentive to fight these things tooth and nail, because they know if they lose out, they're not going to be left completely high and dry. And we could take that lesson and we could apply it to a metropolitan context. And we could say, you know what, we're making a priority to develop portions of the city. We need to accommodate more people so they can have access to local jobs. We recognize that there is going to be disruption associated with that. But what we know is that this new development is going to, we anticipate, is going to increase our tax base, increase our property tax base. And so what we're going to do is take some of that projected rise in revenue and use it to abate the taxes paid by others in the immediate area. It sort of feels like a bribe, but I think the right way to think about it is as compensation for you. We recognize that you're suffering something that you didn't ask for, and this is us compensating you for it. And therefore, the people in proximity to new developments have less of an incentive to sort of go to the mat to fight upzonings or new developments that are proposed. And then there's a third possibility, which actually I think has been, the sort of potential here has been highlighted by Amazon's decision, actually. And I think what we've seen has been really fascinating for me, I imagine for you as well. But what we've seen since Amazon made this decision to build a new HQ somewhere, city leaders suddenly feeling this urgency to kind of reflect on the decisions they've made about infrastructure investment, about investment in their local educational institutions and in public goods and other amenities, and saying, goodness, we've really kind of fallen behind in providing these things for our citizens. Now we have an opportunity to rally together and do this, and we want to do it because landing Amazon is something that's going to benefit everyone. And I think that's really instructive, because whenever you're doing these big investment programs, there are going to be winners as well as losers. But when you can dangle a carrot like Amazon there in front of the potential losers and say, look, even if you're not going to win as much as others, you're still going to be made better off because this is a big deal, then that changes the dynamics of that policy debate in that area. And that helps build momentum to invest in transit, to invest in schools, to invest in community amenities. And now the thing we ought to note is that you don't have to wait for Amazon to do that, or another company to decide it wants to build another HQ. There aren't a lot of Amazons out there, and Amazon's probably not going to build HQs in every major city in America or minor city in America. But we can apply those same lessons to federal government policy. And if we're interested in sort of changing the way local leaders think about planning, or in supporting people who are really trying to push for investments that are badly needed in this country, well, then we could develop a program where we say, we're going to increase the potential funding for infrastructure that's available, and we're going to allocate it based on the cities that are best able to come up with plans that provide for the kind of growth that we think this country needs to improve access to good jobs, to address inequality. It doesn't just have to be infrastructure funding either. We could have, we have lots of government-sponsored or government-directed research institutes around the country. Those in turn could be offered to cities that promise to sort of build a political consensus in providing the things that are going to allow them to thrive. And so I think that too is something to look at. But I guess I would I'll close by offering one third potential way forward. And I know that the people in this room work very hard at what you do. You care a lot about trying to improve the way we plan and grow our cities, and care quite a lot about it. But I think it's important always to remember, and I'm sure you do, I don't want to patronize you, but it's important to realize that all these debates happen in the context of the built environment we already have. So if we say to people in San Francisco, Houston builds 50,000 homes each year, and that's why their houses are so cheap. People in San Francisco will say, I know, and we don't want to look anything like Houston. Houston's a lovely city, by the way. But it's understandable why people in San Francisco might not want to have that model, might not want to have sprawl be a feature of their landscape, might not want to build lots of homes in a floodplain, and so on. And so it's up to all of us, I think, to offer them something better. To say that, it is possible to have design of homes, of neighborhoods, and of cities that is attractive, that is functional, design that is activated by density, which is enlivened by density and not overburdened by density, design that presents to people a positive vision of how cities can work and function. And I know that this is something that you guys carry with you all the time, but what I would want to stress here is that the stakes are high. However high you think the stakes are, answering these critical questions. How do we create diverse communities with better access to more jobs? And how do we do it in a way that we can get buy-in from existing residents who stand to lose from development? There's an incredible sense of urgency about it, and we all need to keep that at the forefront of our minds as we think about what we're going to try to change about policy and about the way we do our jobs in the future. So I think at this point, that's the end of my remarks, and we have a little bit of time for Q&A if we'd like to do that.
Hey, I'm Richard Dunn. What an opportunity. Thank you. My question is about, 40, 50 years ago, I went to college, and they had a book by Paul Samuelson. I don't know if anybody else remembers him, but he was an economist, something I jumped in my head. But I think he sort of had a philosophy that as the economy moves forward, of course, that was then, this is now, we all know that, things got better on average for everybody. I'm just wondering, maybe I think I have two questions. First question is, did you find any of the numbers that you presented before that would have been perhaps counter to what you're proposing. That is, finances are actually better. And a couple things come to my mind, but I'm not a statistician and I haven't written books like you have. One of them would be, it seems like right now, at least in the USA and I think generally around the world, a higher percentage of people are getting jobs. Now, I think almost all of us probably agree there is a difference between the wealthy and the poor, or the average, and that spread's getting bigger, but still, more people are getting jobs. And some families, as we say, have two, or maybe in a family has two adults and maybe 2 or 3 jobs even maybe. So that's, but still, that helps that family, I would guess. So I'm just sort of trying to build a little case here, like a little bit of a case, maybe to see if you can refute me easily or not embarrass me too bad. The second thing would be, some things, like I have in my pocket a phone and pay way too much for it, but there are Indians living in the reservations in western Panama that have a phone that would probably do about 50% of what my phone will do when they have electricity and it's charged. That gives some kind of equality there that might not actually be, and that person there is earning probably less than $400 a year. That's just a couple things. And then many of us who are older, like me, have had children go to college, and when they finished college, they came home for a visit and stayed like 2 years maybe, something like that. But then eventually they went to Portland, Oregon, or San Diego, and I was in Chicago, whatever. So there is still some aspects of mobility, and some of that mobility is even much, much faster. I flew up here last night and got into a hotel and I'm talking to different people along the way. One person was giving yoga classes in Atlanta, I think, for a week, and then they went back to wherever they were going. Another person, they have 2 homes. One's near Baltimore, and the other is in somewhere in Alabama. Mm-hmm. And they both have jobs. And I couldn't even keep track with what she was telling me. So I'm just saying we have an awful lot of mobility. I think airlines are moving people so much faster than they did. Okay, I'm talking too much.
Sure.
No, my point would be, I think there's a lot of mobility, and I think there are some evidences that the economy is helping many people. And it's also like, dental insurance, if you've got it, it's great,
Great. Very good questions. If I forget one, I'll come back to you to remind me of it. So let's see. I guess I'll start with your second point, which is that it is true that there are qualitative improvements in the things that we have available to us that aren't always reflected in GDP. So, we can binge watch all sorts of television programs now in a way that we couldn't in the past. That's not going to show up as a higher income for us, but it is something that we're glad to have. And there are those things out there. And so it probably wouldn't be accurate to say that there has been no improvement in the standard of living. At the same time, it remains the case that lots of important things like housing and healthcare and all sorts of other stuff still cost money. It becomes a problem when actual incomes are not going up by very much. And I think it's one reason we really know it's a problem is that we aren't just seeing rising inequality, but an increase in generational immobility. So not geographic immobility, but people who are born into the lower rungs of the income ladder are not having as an easy time moving up to the upper rungs of the income ladder. And that suggests that something machinery here is broken that needs to be looked at. You are absolutely right that employment is growing. It's at an all-time high in Germany and Britain. The unemployment rate here is quite low as well. I don't really see that as a refutation of what I'm saying for a few reasons. I think one is that a lot of these jobs are not very good jobs. To think back sort of about the guy running the warehouse who's making a decision whether to automate, a choice that would raise productivity and potentially improve efficiency, or to continue employing lots of people because he has the pick of minimum wage workers available to him. It would be better if we automated that warehouse and then liberated those workers to go and invest in training and get a better job somewhere else. I think growth in really tenuous low-wage jobs is better than no growth in jobs, but it's worse than improvement in both the quantity and the quality of jobs. And then what was the last one? Oh, mobility. Well, it is true that Americans remain more mobile than Europeans. So we, by comparison to people in other places, we're a fairly mobile country. But it's also the case that mobility has fallen over time, and mobility rates are highest across the age spectrum for the youngest people. That's when people move the most. But that's also where some of the sharpest declines in mobility have occurred, and that's really worrying because it's those initial moves when you're jumping from job to job and place to place, learning new skills, figuring out what you like to do and where you want to do it, that you really make a lot of big income gains and learn a lot about yourself and all sorts of things. So I think I don't want to say that everything is completely awful and no one's moving anywhere, but it does seem like the opportunities we have now are meaningfully worse than they were, even when I was graduating from college, which was like 17 years ago. So I hope that answers the question. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
My question may be a simple one. It concerns population growth. Richard Florida this morning described a lifetime that arcs about 60 years. And in that time frame, we saw about 100 million people come into this country, natural native birth and immigration. In the next 30 years, we're going to see that kind of population growth. And we've been taught that the baby boom and other things made a big difference during that time frame. So when I read Robert Gordon's book about, you'll have to help me with the title, but about the limits to growth after 1970 in terms of economic growth and the GDP, I wonder, where does the population growth factor into that? It's a big question, but I hope you can help me know.
It is a big question, and even though population growth is slowing, we do anticipate that the population of the U.S. will get quite a lot larger between now and 2050. I think it's supposed to rise to like 450 million or something. I think, part of the way you interpret that depends a little bit on what story you buy about the future. If you subscribe to Robert Gordon's ideas, and Robert Gordon is an economist at Northwestern. I guess you may have heard Richard Florida talk about him, but his view is essentially that we've kind of run out of big ideas, run out of new technologies, and we're just never going to grow anything like we did in the past. And then population growth is not something to be looked forward to, because it means that we're going to have fewer and fewer resources to share out across the people that we have here. I tend to think he's wrong. I think that's not actually the case, and really that the potential for quite impressive growth is there, and I think it's really hard to deny that if you look at kind of the amazing technological developments that we're seeing now. The question is, that was two questions really. How do we make sure that technologies go from the drawing board to actually out there in the world where they're improving lives? And then second, how do we make sure that population growth, that the new people that that are being born or they're coming to the country are prepared and have the opportunity to take full advantage of those new technologies and to enjoy high incomes as a result. And I think these are all policy questions. It's just a simple question of whether we get it right or not. And I think we absolutely have the capacity to get it right. And certainly my hope is that we will. And I think a huge component of that is making sure that in the places where these new technologies are being developed, where we're learning to apply them, where we're figuring out what we can do usefully with them, that we're able to accept a lot of population growth and have a lot of people be exposed to those discussions, to learn those skills and techniques, to participate in those local economies. I think that really is a critical component of making sure that we're able to take advantage of population growth. So I'm an optimist in that sense. I probably didn't seem very optimistic in my talk, did I? But I am an optimist in that respect. Yes.
I'm just curious about the relevance of sort of private investment and access to capital in this. Sort of anecdotally, what it seems like has happened. I know you mentioned sort of one of the effects of globalization is the financial industry has globalized and moved much more away from sort of local. Seems like one of the downsides of that is you're seeing then, capital used to be the idea that money was lent locally, to businesses. So, both supported local businesses, but there was a direct connection between lenders and jobs and sort of meaningful work in communities. As you globalize that, it becomes purely about profit and return on investment, and you devalue all these other pieces of sort of quality of place. And so I'm wondering, does that play into the work? And is that something, like how does that trend get reversed? Because I don't see it
that's a very
happening.
good point. So I'll sort of one quick thing to preface my answer is that, I think there used to be the view in economics that sort of public investment and private investment sort of crowded each other out. And so if you had more investment in infrastructure and things of that nature, you tended to get less private infrastructure. Interest rates would go up, people would borrow less. And I think actually the last decade or two has made very clear that that's not the case, that they actually are quite complementary. But to get to your question, I think you're absolutely right. We have asset classes that are sort of very emerging market based. And so people can say, I want to have exposure to China, and I want to put my money there because I think it's a promising place to invest. And you can go pick out from a menu of funds to do that. But you can't say, what I really think Cleveland is going to be successful in the future, and I want to invest in Cleveland, in a Cleveland fund. And there are actually people working on this. I don't know if you're familiar with EIG. Actually, there's a bill also, I'm going to forget the name of it, but perhaps someone can help me. But there's a legislation that has been proposed that would encourage people to develop these local area funds. And so you can invest in something like a Detroit fund or an Illinois fund. And the advantage to that is that so much of what we talk about with cities is about scale. So if you want to rejuvenate a downtown that's struggling, it doesn't help to put a business there if no people live there. And it doesn't help to put housing there if there's no businesses there, right? Because you have to have all of these things together for a place to thrive. If you have an asset manager who's got a bunch of funding to play with and is able to coordinate investments, and so to say, we're going to fund this residential investment, at the same time we're going to fund these retail investments, and we're also going to fund this venture capital firm, then you've got the ability to coordinate within a single place and to get that cluster development going. And so I think that is an important part of the picture. That's a thing that I think is worth focusing more attention on.
Well, join me in thanking Ryan for an enlightening luncheon talk.
Thank you all very much. Thank you. I really enjoyed it.